So dark and tall, dark and handsome. Why are you eating this sandwich like that?
How am I supposed to eat it?
You're supposed to eat it like this. Vertically.
Why would you do that?
Supposed to eat it
Put
vertically.
a hole in my sandwich.
Alright, you're welcome. Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to talk about minimum wage laws and how it's not that simple. We're going to talk about these things on the board, what politicians say. We're going to talk about what actually happens. This was what actually happens, but we decided to actually spell it right. Had some help on that. We're going to talk about the history, the Great Depression, racist roots, which is in the title today. And lastly, we're going to talk about what the government does to quell the public and keep them poor. So first, for what politicians say, what better place to start than straight from the horse's mouth? Not that horse.
Last 40 years, the middle class of our country has been in decline. That in Vermont and all over this country, we have people working 2 or 3 jobs. We have people working 50, 60, 70 hours a week just to put food on the table, just to make sure that their families can live with a modicum of dignity. And the reason for all of that is that wages in the United States of America are just too low. And the time is long overdue for us to raise the minimum wage, which is now at the federal level $7.25 an hour, which I think under any definition is a starvation wage. We have got to raise the minimum wage to a living wage, and what we are here today to say is that living wage is $15 an hour. Now, I know it is a radical concept for our Republican friends, but we believe that in the United States of America, the wealthiest country in the history of the world, that if you work 40 hours a week or 50 hours a week, you should not be living in poverty. It must be a wage that people can live in dignity with. It has been 10 years since Congress passed legislation to raise the minimum wage. Since 1968, the minimum wage has lost more than 25% of its purchasing power as millions of Americans work longer hours for lower wages. Their wages are not keeping up with inflation. After adjusting for inflation, the minimum wage today is worth less than it was 50 years ago. So if you want to know why people all over this country are angry, why they're bitter, why they are disenchanted with the government, the truth is they are asking why it is the people on top are doing fantastically well, and yet their standard of living is going down. The erosion of the federal minimum wage is a major reason why more than 43 million Americans are living in poverty. Health care costs are going up, child care costs are going up, college costs are going up, housing costs are going up, but wages for millions of workers are not going up. So here we are today to say to the working people of this country, we know you can't make it on $8 an hour, $10 an hour. We say to the single mothers all over this country who are working desperately to protect their kids, we know you're not making it on $12 an hour. Our job in the wealthiest country in the history of the world is to make sure that every worker at least has a modest and decent standard of living. So today we're here to say, let's raise this minimum wage to $15 an hour.
Before we go into that, we have to think about 2 schools of economics. So the first one is the Keynesian School of Economics, which is basically what our system operates on today. It's a system where the government tries to smooth things out through the Federal Reserve, through the money printing, through taxes, through things like that, just government interventions. The other school is the Austrian school, which basically operates on a system of supply and demand. It says things such as, if you have artificially high prices, prices will have to come down. To give you guys an example of that, think about when the pandemic first started. Everybody stopped driving, right? So everybody stopped buying oil. What happened to gas prices? Gas prices went way down. And basically what happened when the gas prices went way down was that they couldn't come back up even when the government printed a bunch of money, because there was still no demand for oil because people were still not driving. So those prices went all the way down until people were able to start driving, people were able to start traveling again. Then the prices went back up because there was demand and the prices went back up. On the other hand, things like consumer goods, things like business valuations, when we printed money for that, people started going back to businesses. People started spending on Amazon. People started spending at Apple, Microsoft, all these other things. So those valuations went right back up when we printed the money. What's the issue with that? The issue with that is that even though, let's say I give somebody just enough money so that they can pay my buddy over there, right? Am I really giving them the money, or am I creating the money from thin air and then giving it basically directly to my buddy? I'm basically giving the money to my buddy because the people over here that I'm supposedly helping, they already owe money to my friend. So I'm basically printing money and giving it to my friend. So what's the issue with that? The issue is that stock prices started to go down at the beginning of the pandemic, but when the government started printing money, started basically giving people enough money so that they could buy at these inflated prices that we're experiencing right now, instead of asset prices coming down, which the richer people who hold assets, those asset prices didn't come down because the government printed enough money so that people could buy the goods at those inflated prices. If you were to not let people buy at those inflated prices, people selling the goods would have to bring their prices down, as happened in the oil industry, but didn't happen in other industries where there's still demand. So all of that to say that making prices too high creates an unsaleable surplus. So when you think about that, you have to think about not just goods, but also services. So services, what is that? That's essentially your labor. Your labor power has a certain price to it. And people really don't believe in the price of labor. And the one way to really test that theory is to think about it. If you were to, say, go apply for another job somewhere else with your current skill set, if you can't get someone to pay more at another job and you go to the next job, you can't get them to pay more, you go to the next job, you can't get them to pay more. The market has set your price at a certain price and you have to accept that. And once you do accept that, it kind of sets you free because you realize, hey, I have a price basically on my labor, and that's what it's worth. That's how much value I'm able to create for companies. And if I increase that value, then I can create more for myself. So let's talk about what actually happens. So what actually happens when you raise minimum wages? So one thing that I really like from this book, which is where a lot of this information came from, it's called Basic Economics. I'm going to throw it on the screen here right now. One thing that I really like is that he says, no matter what you set the minimum wage at, the real minimum wage will always be zero. So what does that mean? Am I talking about slavery? Like, what are you talking about, Casey? Slavery? No, the real minimum wage is always zero, because if you get laid off, your wages have just gone to zero. If you're not worth paying a certain amount and then the minimum wage goes up, your job is either going offshore, it's getting automated, or you're going to zero. So let's talk about some history. So what we see throughout history, and I'll give you guys a couple of examples of this, is that when minimum wage laws were introduced, they were introduced so that they could price out low-wage workers from unfavored groups. So we're talking about Japanese people in the 1920s in Canada. We're talking about Black people in the postbellum South. For example, the 1930 Black unemployment rate was lower than the white unemployment rate. 1931, the Davis-Bacon Act was instituted. In 1933, the National Industrial Recovery Act was instituted. And in 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act went into effect. All three proposed unionization intended to price Black workers out of jobs. In addition, there were some rules that barred Black membership of these unions that were formed. So if you weren't in the union, you couldn't get a job. So we're into a Great Depression here, and we're talking about the government basically stepping in and being helpful, and what those impacts actually were. So a lot of people don't know the real story of the Great Depression or the story of the Great Depression at all. So the National Recovery Act was put into effect in 1938, and it raised wages of textile workers by 70%. This was estimated to cost black workers 500,000 jobs, and later it was determined to be unconstitutional. However, in 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act instituted a minimum wage federally in 1938. Around that time, the black unemployment rate for people aged 16 to 17, and just to clarify, unemployment means people who don't have a job that are looking for a job. So it's not just the other thing, which is labor force participation, which is how many people exist versus how many people are working. These are people that are looking for jobs that cannot find jobs. In 1948, the black unemployment rate for those aged 16 to 17 was 9.4%, and for white, it was 10.2%. In 1948, 18 to 19 years old, the unemployment rate for black folks was 10.5%, and for whites, it was 9.4%. Throughout the 1950s, there was increasing federal minimum wages, which continued to price teens out of work. And as we all know, teenagers that don't have any legitimate sources of income usually turn to crime, or they'll turn to, some other way to make money. So some way that could be illegal, or they just stay in school, which benefits the teachers and the teachers unions. So I've got a little graph that I'm going to throw on the screen right here, and it shows from 1975 all the way through 2015. It shows the unemployment rate, white versus black, and as we see, the average for black is 36.6% and 16.8% for white. So from the time of before the 1950s, when it used to be below 10%, for black it has gone up to 36.6%. So it's interesting that we talk about how this is beneficial to people who are poor or minorities, but the facts would suggest something else. It's not as cut and dry as it would seem. So like we said earlier, the beneficiaries of raising the minimum wage are not necessarily people who earn low wages. The beneficiaries are people who earn low wages and keep their jobs at the same time. All right, so I want to give you guys some personal examples, some anecdotes from my own life, from my own company. Basically what happened when we had a union agreement and we essentially raised our wages. I want to tell you guys about what happened. So on my shift, we used to have about 15 people, like 15 to 12 people each night. And what they've essentially done now that the wages went up is that they didn't necessarily fire people, because it's very hard to do that with unions. It's actually a very expensive process for some people to be fired. So what they did was, instead of firing people, they've essentially just not hired people back on. So when people quit, they don't hire another person back on. They just get capital, they invest capital into machinery, and what they do is they just replace that person with a machine that does the same job. So instead of replacing those people, we used to have little minions. I'm a tech. We used to have little people that set up our basically our plates, our samples, whatever. Instead of replacing those with people, which could be cheaper if you could pay lower wages, they've replaced those people with machines, which in the long run, if wages are going to continue to go up, at some point wages are going to be too high for it to be beneficial cost-wise to keep those people on. Another sentiment I get out there a lot is this exploited worker concept, like this idea that the big evil corporation is extracting your labor and they're just taking everything that they can out of you. And a lot of people don't really understand the production side, and they also don't understand the psychology of the market. And if you're to understand that, then you would really understand what's going on. So what's really going on, I'll use my coworker as an example. This person complains a lot about how much they hate their job. They complain about how they should be paid more. And I ask them, hey, well, if you should be paid more, you hate your job, have you ever thought about leaving? And they're like, oh, well, I've tried to leave, but nobody's willing to pay me as much as they pay me here. So I was like, so this is your best opportunity that you have, right? So that's kind of how market psychology works. The reason why I haven't left my job is because there's no job out there every time I've tried to leave, there's no job that's paying me based on my position as much as I am currently making. So that's how you allocate resources in such a way that they're in their best usage. If I could get paid more to go do something else right now that I knew of, I would probably go do that thing. So basically what I'm saying is, to say that people are worse off for having a job that doesn't pay as much is it doesn't make sense when you consider the alternative, which is them not having a job at all. So they're better off than if they didn't have a job at all. All right, so what really happens? What does the government do to quell the public and keep them poor? So essentially what you can do if you want to quell the public and keep them poor is you can raise their wages, right? That causes a distortion in the market, as we talked about. It causes a distortion in the labor market. But over time, as long as you keep on printing money, as long as you keep on inflating the value of the dollar away, then eventually, if you have this fight for 15, eventually $15 isn't going to be worth much. So the fight for 15, essentially, as long as you continue that inflation machine, you keep that money printer going, the fight for 15 doesn't really mean a lot. And what we really need to focus on is there's only a certain number of beachfront properties in this world. There's only a certain number, there's scarce resources, in other words. There's only a certain number of whatever you want out there. And society has decided that certain types of people are going to have the most access to those things. So the thing that we need to focus on is being one of those types of people. Overall prosperity, and what we are told, and what I was told growing up, is that it's kind of a disaster that so many people are not paid a living wage, which they don't usually define that term. A living wage is a wage that's suitable to feed a family of 4. So interesting thing about that living wage, 42% of people who make minimum wage live with a family member or a parent. Or in other words, most minimum wage workers are not supporting a family, they're being supported by their family. Only 15% of minimum wage workers actually support a family. Okay, so I had a little gaffe when I was putting this video together, and I recognized it while I was editing, so I'm putting in just the raw, unedited clip from Thomas Sowell's book. I hope you guys go check it out, and I hope that this is perspective shifting for you, this clip, as it was perspective shifting for me. So enjoy this little clip, and we'll get back to the video after it. It's about 4 minutes long.
Radically different trends are found when looking at statistics based on comparisons of top and bottom income brackets over time, rather than following individual income earners over the same span of time. For example, it is a widely publicized fact that census data show the percentage of the national income going to those in the bottom 20% bracket has been declining over the years, while the percentage going to those in the top 20% has been rising, and the amount going to those in the top 1% has been rising especially sharply. This has led to the familiar refrain that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, a notion that provides the media with the kind of dramatic and alarming news stories that sell newspapers and attract television audiences, as well as being ideologically satisfying to some and politically useful to others. The real question, however, is it true? A diametrically opposite picture is found when comparing what happens to specific individuals over time. Unfortunately, most statistics, including those from the U.S. Bureau of the Census, do not follow particular individuals over time, even though the illusion that they do may be fostered by data on income categories over time. Among the few studies which have actually followed individual Americans over time, one from the University of Michigan and another from the Internal Revenue Service, show patterns similar to each other but radically different from the often cited patterns in data from the Census Bureau and other sources. The University of Michigan study followed the same individuals from 1975 through 1991, and the Internal Revenue Service study followed individuals through their income tax returns from 1996 through 2005. The University of Michigan study found that among working Americans who were in the bottom 20% in income in 1975, approximately 95% had risen out of that bracket by 1991, including 29% who had reached the top quintile by 1991, compared to only 5% who still remained in the bottom quintile. The largest absolute amount of increase in income between 1975 and 1991 was among those people who were initially in the bottom quintile in 1975, and the least absolute increase in income was among those who were initially in the top quintile in 1975. In other words, the incomes of people who were initially at the bottom rose more than the incomes of people who were initially at the top. This is the direct opposite of the picture presented by census data, based on following income brackets over time, instead of following the people who are moving in and out of those brackets. Similar patterns appeared in statistics from the Internal Revenue Service, which also followed given individuals. The IRS found that between 1996 and 2005, the income of individuals who had been in the bottom 20% of income tax filers in 1996 had increased by 91% by 2005, and the income of those individuals who were in the top 1% in 1996 had fallen by 26%. It may seem almost impossible that the data from the Bureau of the Census and the data from the IRS and the University of Michigan can all be correct, but they are. Studies of income brackets over time and studies of individual people over time are measuring fundamentally different things that are often confused with one another. A study of individual incomes over time in Canada turned up patterns very similar to those in the United States. During the period from 1990 to 2009, Canadians who were initially in the bottom 20% had both the highest absolute increase in income and the highest percentage increase in income. Only 13% of the Canadians who were initially in the bottom quintile in 1990 were still there in 2009, while 21% of them had risen all the way to the top quintile. Whatever the relationship between one income bracket and another, that is not necessarily the relationship between people, because people are moving from one bracket to another as time goes on. Therefore, the fate of brackets and the fate of people can be very different, and in many cases, completely opposite. When income-earning Americans in the bottom income bracket have their incomes nearly double in a decade, they end up no longer in the bottom bracket. There is nothing mysterious about this, since most people begin their careers in entry-level jobs, and their growing experience over the years leads to higher incomes.
And the last thing I want to get into is an example of what happens when you don't have a minimum wage. What are some examples of places that don't have a minimum wage? Singapore is an example of a place that does not have a minimum wage. During this pandemic, Singapore's unemployment rate spiked up to a high of 2.9%. This is the highest it's been in Singapore in over a decade, and it's lower than the US unemployment rate was before the pandemic. When Hong Kong was still a British colony, it did not have any minimum wage laws, and its unemployment rate was consistently under 2%. During the Coolidge administration from 1923 to 1929, there was no minimum wage laws, there was no intervention as far as business depressions, and there was an unemployment rate of 1.8%. So most people were doing those manufacturing jobs. They always say, where did the manufacturing jobs go? Well, they got priced out when we started introducing minimum wage laws, and the wages started going up to the point where it was like, all right, well, we need to, because these workers don't produce as much value, those jobs were going to the women and the children of the men who were fighting overseas. Those jobs are going to the women and the children, and they were low wage jobs. They were low value jobs. But in my opinion, it would be a fallacy to assert that those people would be better off not having a job than having that job while their husband, father was away. So anyways, hopefully you guys like this video. This is kind of all over the place. Hopefully you guys got something out of it, that it's not so cut and dry, the minimum wage laws. It's not this, you're evil if you think that the minimum wage is bad, or you just want more business profits. Sometimes it's bad for the people who it affects most. Like, for example, me, I make much more than the minimum wage, so if you raise the minimum wage, it doesn't affect my employment in any way. If anything, higher wages have only affected me in a good way, in the sense that the people who left their jobs were not hired back, so there are fewer people to do the same amount of work, so I'm working more overtime. My income has gone up as a result, but other people's incomes have gone to zero, which of course, as you look throughout history, is one thing that actually creates, not solves, income inequality. But for someone who makes low wages, they're the ones who should be most concerned about minimum wage laws, because that is putting their job at the risk the most. So anyways, hopefully you guys like this video. Join the Facebook if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys in the next video.